When my mother died, the first thing I inherited was not grief. Grief had lived with us for years already, thin and practical as the wind that scraped across Red Basin. What I inherited that morning was a tin box from beneath her bed, a key tied with blue thread, and 3 oil-stained notebooks full of rivers that did not exist. Our town sat on a shelf of cracked clay at the edge of the southern salt flats, where freight trains screamed past without stopping and the wells coughed up more dust than water. My mother had spent half her life teaching children to read in a school with a roof, patched by flattened fuel cans, and the other half staring at maps like a woman trying to hear a song trapped under stone. In Red Basin, people did not ask many questions about the dead, because every answer led to another absence we could not afford. So after we buried her on the hill above the abandoned rail spur, I went home alone, washed the grave dust from my hands, and opened the first notebook. Each page was crowded with equations, contour lines, and small notes written in the quick, slanted hand I had known from grocery lists and school excuses. But there were other things too. Dates from before I was born, sketches of sluice gates, names of reservoirs hundreds of miles north, and one sentence underlined so hard the pen had torn the paper. Water remembers the shape of every hand that steals it. I read that line until sunset crawled across the floorboards, and I might have sat there all night if someone had not knocked at my door. No one in Red Basin knocked like that. 3 measured taps, a pause, then 2 more, as if even wood should understand rank. When I opened the door, a woman in a sand-colored coat stood on my step with a driver behind her, and a black vehicle idling in the street. She looked clean in a way our town never allowed, as though dust itself had been warned away from her shoes. "June Arlen?" she asked. I nodded. She gave a brief glance to the room behind me, to the hanging kettle, the cracked basin, the notebooks on the table, then returned to my face. "My name is Mara Quill. I'm the executive director of the Meridian Foundation. I have come on behalf of Mr. Lucian Vale." The name meant little to me then. In Red Basin, rich men were weather. We knew their effects better than their faces. "He worked with your mother," Mara continued. "There are matters of record and scholarship that concern you." I remember almost laughing. Record and scholarship were words people used in cities with polished windows, not in a town where we rationed lamp oil. But then she placed a folder on my table. Inside was a photograph of my mother at perhaps 19, standing before a wall of blueprints beside a younger Lucian Vale, both of them smiling as if the world had once been generous. I had never seen that version of her. I had never even known such a version existed. "Your mother was admitted at 16 to the Helix Institute in Halcyon," Mara said. She later worked as a junior systems cartographer on the Tide Map project. The word slid past me at first. Helix Institute was famous even in places with no libraries. As school people described the way villagers once described palaces. "You're mistaken," I said. My mother taught reading and repaired water filters with wire and prayer. She never talked about any institute. Mara's face did not soften, but something careful moved behind her eyes. No, she rarely talked about that life after she left it. She told me Lucian Vale had created a scholarship in my mother's name years ago, though no one had found a recipient suitable to it. Now, after my mother's death, he wanted to offer it directly to me, full tuition at Helix for my final 2 years of secondary study, and whatever came after, housing, books, travel, everything. It sounded too large to trust. In Red Basin, generosity always arrived attached to a pipe, a vote, or a debt. "What does he want in return?" I asked. Mara's answer came without hesitation. "Nothing but your education." I looked at the notebooks on the table. If my mother had lied by silence all my life, then the truth was somewhere far from Red Basin. So I asked the only thing that mattered. "If I go, will I be allowed to see the Tide Map archives?" Mara took a fraction too long to respond. "Yes," she said at last, "with supervision." I closed the folder and told her I would leave in the morning. The ride to Halcyon took 13 hours. I spent them pressed to the window watching Red Basin flatten into salt plains, then scrub country, then the first green canals I had ever seen. By the time the city rose ahead of us, all glass and suspended rails and towers shining like knives, my chest felt too small for my lungs. My mother used to tell me the world was bigger than suffering. Halcyon looked like proof and accusation at once. The Helix campus sat on an island in the middle of the North Canal, connected to the city by 3 arched bridges and a private tram line. Students crossed its courtyards in tailored uniforms with badges sewn in silver thread, carrying tablets thinner than the slate boards we used at home. Every surface gleamed. Every voice seemed polished. I followed Mara through the admissions hall in my one decent dress and boots still scarred by basin dust, feeling as visible as a coal mark on white linen. People noticed. Their eyes traveled over my cuffs, my hands, the cheap braid I had tied myself. No one said anything out loud until registration. A girl with a flawless black uniform and a silver pin shaped like a swallow looked at my file, then at me, then smiled without warmth. "So you are the Memorial Scholarship," she said. I thought there would be at least a ceremony. Her badge read, Seraphine Quill. Mara's daughter, as it turned out. Her voice carried the kind of boredom only rich people could afford. Seraphine, Mara said sharply. The girl lifted one shoulder. What? I am welcoming her to the Institute. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice just enough to make cruelty intimate. Try not to look stunned in the dining hall. It embarrasses the donors when scholarship cases stare at the ceiling. I met her eyes and said, then maybe the ceiling should learn some humility. For the first time, she looked surprised. That exchange followed me into my first weeks at Helix. I was placed in Section 9, not the prestigious Apex cohort reserved for students with family sponsorships and legacy admissions. Officially, the division was about scheduling. Unofficially, Apex received the best faculty, the best lab hours, the earliest access to the archives, and every assumption of brilliance before anyone solved a single problem. Section 9 got leftovers and a homeroom tutor who smelled faintly of coffee and gave us the sort of encouraging speeches one offers people expected to fail quietly. Still, I had not come to Helix for comfort. I had come because my mother had hidden entire continents inside silence, and I intended to find them. Every morning I woke before dawn in the dormitory tower, ran the outer bridge while the canal was still pearl gray, then spent an hour with my mother's notebooks before classes began. In physics, I was behind on terminology but ahead on intuition. In mathematics, I found the schoolwork almost insultingly tidy. At home, we solved for survival, flow rates through corroded pipes, evaporation loss from open cisterns, weight tolerances for patched rail carts. Numbers meant consequence. So when our first systems design assessment came back and my score sat at the top of the entire year, not just Section 9, the campus reacted as if a stray dog had started speaking in Latin. Teachers looked at me longer. Students asked where I had copied my method. One boy from Apex requested to see my scratch paper to check whether I had made an error in my favor. I handed him the work. He stared at it, frowned, and said, "You solved the stability matrix backward."
"Yes," I answered.
It was quicker. He stopped speaking to me after that. The one exception was a boy named Adrian Vale. He was Lucian's nephew, though I did not know it at first, and the reigning star of Apex. He had a reputation for winning whatever competition he entered, and a manner so dry it could turn rain into paperwork. In class discussion, he listened more than he spoke, which at Helix counted as radical behavior. After the assessment, he found me in the machine shop, where I was fixing a broken clamp no one had bothered to report. "You used field loss assumptions from agricultural pump models," he said. It was not a question. Yes. He studied the repaired clamp. "Those models are not in the curriculum." I wiped grease from my hands. "Neither is drought." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once. 3 days later, my archive access request was denied. The notice cited procedural restrictions on active project materials, though the Tide Map project had been dormant for nearly 20 years. I went to the records office. They sent me to the foundation wing. The foundation wing sent me to an assistant in an office with no windows and too many ferns. The assistant smiled, apologized, and explained that some documents connected to national water security remained sealed by board order. "Even for family?" I asked. "Especially for anyone emotionally involved," she said. That night, I wrote the sentence from my mother's notebook on the inside of my wrist. "Water remembers the shape of every hand that steals it." Then I went to the old library basement, where a retired archivist named Mr. Dorian was rumored to guard the dead files no one else wanted. He was there, asleep in a chair beneath a lamp, with 4 books open on his chest. When I woke him and asked about Tide Map, he peered at me over his spectacles and said, "Everyone who asks that question is either dangerous or grieving." "Which one am I?" He looked at my face more carefully. "Too early to tell. Come back with tea and proper manners." So I did. For the next month, I brought tea and repaired his filing drawer and pretended not to notice when he quietly slid me adjacent catalogs. Tide Map itself remained locked, but project memos were not. Purchase ledgers were not. Staff notices were not. From scraps, a history emerged. The Tide Map project had been designed to predict subterranean water movement across the Southern Territories using atmospheric data, historical riverbeds, and adaptive reservoir models. If completed, it could have transformed drought planning for towns like mine. It might have told us where to drill, when to store, when to reroute, and who was siphoning more than their share. Then, 15 years ago, the project was abruptly shut down after an internal dispute. My mother resigned the same week and disappeared from the city. Disappeared. That was the word the documents used, as if leaving on purpose and being erased by convenience were the same thing. My second breakthrough came from the annual Meridian Trials, an engineering competition so important that half the city treated it like a national sport. Teams of students designed practical systems for a public problem. The winners received grants, internships, and enough prestige to make ordinary failure impossible ever again. Seraphine Quill had won the junior division twice. This year, she intended to win the senior division with a sensor array for luxury canal districts. I submitted a solo proposal for modular groundwater listeners, cheap devices that could be buried along dry channels to estimate underground moisture by acoustic response. The judges nearly rejected it for being too region-specific. I had to explain that regions were where people lived. When the shortlist was posted, my name appeared beside Seraphine's and Adrian's. By lunch, everyone knew. By dinner, someone had dumped a tray of sugared fruit over my drafting table in the common studio, soaking half my paper schematics. No one admitted it. The room had cameras, but that particular corridor feed was mysteriously corrupted for 7 minutes. I salvaged what I could, redrew the rest, and kept working until the janitorial lights dimmed. Around midnight, a fresh roll of drafting film appeared at my elbow. Adrian stood there with 2 coffees and said, "The shop clerk told me you bought the cheapest paper because the good stock was rationed." I considered that an inefficiency. "Is this philanthropy?" I asked. "No," he said. "Competitive self-interest. I prefer beating people at full strength." That was how our alliance began. Insult wrapped around respect like wire around a splint. Adrian had access, of course. Not to everything, but to rooms I could not enter and conversations that shifted when I approached. He told me Lucian Vale rarely came to campus anymore because of his health. He told me Mara Quill effectively ran the foundation board. He told me my mother's name was spoken carefully in older departments, as if it might still start a fire. What happened between her and the board, I asked. Adrian stared out the workshop window before replying. No one says the same thing twice. That usually means the truth is expensive. The preliminary trials exhibition was held in the North Pavilion. Sponsors wandered between prototypes while students smiled like diplomats at war. Seraphine's display glowed under custom lighting. She wore her confidence like jewelry. When she stopped at my table, the cameras nearby made her kindness theatrical. "What a charming rural project," she said. "It is almost like aid work." I adjusted a sensor node and replied, "What a charming urban one." "It is almost like decoration." Her smile sharpened. "Careful. People do not like it when guests forget they are guests." "Then they should stop building institutions on public money," I said. The judges arrived before she could answer. During my demonstration, I fed the listeners data from a decommissioned canal bed south of Halcyon. The system predicted an underground branch stream far larger than municipal records acknowledged. One judge frowned and asked where I had sourced the baseline survey. "From archived topographical scans and post-flood insurance maps," I said. "The city's official hydrology file omits the channel." That earned me a long, unreadable look from Mara Quill across the hall. I advanced to the final round. So did Adrian. So did Seraphine, whose project had been quietly reframed overnight from luxury district optimization to citywide leak detection, as if vocabulary itself could wash a thing clean. A week later, I received my first invitation to Lucian Vale's residence. It arrived on heavy cream paper with no explanation. His house stood above the western terraces where Halcyon opened toward the sea. It was less ostentatious than I expected. All stone corridors, internal gardens, and the kind of silence money buys by removing all necessity. Lucian Vale was in the conservatory, wrapped in a dark blanket, though the day was warm. Age had pared him down to bone and will, but his eyes were keen. For one disorienting second, I understood why my mother had once trusted him. He looked like a man who had spent his life trying to outthink disaster and had succeeded just enough to become dangerous.
"You have her mouth when you are angry," he said instead of greeting me.
"And her patience when you are not." I stayed standing. "You knew my mother for years and never came to Red Basin." He accepted the blow as if he had expected it.
"Yes."
"Why offer me a scholarship now?" He folded his hands. "Because I failed her while there was still time to do something useful." It was not enough. It was, however, more honest than what everyone else had given me. He asked about my classes. I answered briefly. Then I told him I knew the tide map had been closed over an internal dispute, and that my mother had left because of it. He looked suddenly tired. She believed water allocation reports were being manipulated, he said. Not by chance. By design. The words settled between us like silt. Manipulated how? He glanced toward the garden doors, though we were alone. Reservoir forecasts were adjusted to favor northern investment corridors. In plain language, I said. Lucian's jaw tightened. Water was diverted toward profitable districts, while southern quotas were reduced on paper before the shortages occurred. I thought of Red Basin's ration bells, of women standing at cracked tanks with numbered pails, of children carrying brackish water past dry schoolyards. My hands went cold. My mother found this, he nodded. She found patterns. She wanted Tide Map completed and released independently. The board wanted the issue handled quietly. The board meaning Mara Quill, a pause. Among others, he coughed hard enough to need the arm of the chair. Did you side with them? I asked. He looked at me with the expression of a man reading his own sentence. I hesitated. That was enough. He gave me nothing else that afternoon except tea, silence, and, when I rose to leave, a brass key engraved with the Meridian seal. For the sub-archive below the old survey hall, he said, there are project storage cabinets there. Officially, they were never inventoried after the closure. Why help me now? He turned his gaze back to the garden. Because some debts grow teeth if you leave them buried. That night, Adrian and I entered the sub-archive through a stairwell behind the Geology Museum. He carried a lamp. I carried the key and my mother's first notebook. The room smelled of metal and old paper. Cabinets stretched into the dark, labeled in faded paint. Half had been emptied. The rest held the bones of a vanished war. We found calibration logs, field surveys, coded correspondence, and finally a sealed case labeled TM Core Mesh B. Inside lay crystalline storage wafers and a folded map stitched with hand annotations in 2 inks. One set of notes belonged to Lucian. The other belonged to my mother. I knew her pressure points instantly. The impatient slashes. The circles turned into tiny storms when she disagreed. At the bottom of the map she had written, if this copy survives, compare reservoir release schedule against freight manifests from Quill Maritime. Follow the salt shipments. Adrian read the line twice. Quill Maritime, he said slowly. Mara's family company. Then why are there salt shipments in a water model? We learned the answer over the next several weeks, stealing hours from sleep and from whatever normal adolescence looked like in a school like Helix. Quill Maritime did not merely transport goods. Through a chain of shell firms, it leased emergency pumping contracts, canal maintenance rights, and desalination routes across the South. When drought alerts intensified, prices rose. When reservoirs unexpectedly failed, emergency tenders multiplied. Scarcity, in short, had owners. My mother had seen the pattern while integrating freight movement into Tide Map's predictive engine. If water disappeared before the records admitted it, someone had to profit from the gap. She had tried to force the board to publish the findings. Instead, the project was dismantled, and she was pressured to sign a confidentiality order broad enough to strangle a city. She refused. She left. Sometime after that, her access history vanished from the official archive, though not from the physical logs tucked into forgotten cabinets underground. The more I read, the more my anger stopped burning and started sharpening. Heat makes noise. Sharpness makes decisions. At school, the hostility changed shape. No one called me Charity anymore. They called me obsessive, ambitious, calculating. It was meant as condemnation. I accepted it as administrative shorthand. Meanwhile, Seraphine began losing ground in places she had always ruled by habit. She still had the clothes, the loyal satellites, the inherited authority, but she could not bear that I had become difficult to dismiss. One evening, she cornered me in the west corridor after seminar, where the windows reflected us back as if the building wanted witnesses. I know you've been poking around old files, she said. You think because one dead woman left notes, you can march in and decide who the villains are. Interesting that you assume there are villains. Her mouth tightened. My mother built this foundation. She built the scholarships, the labs, the districts your town begs aid from. My town does not beg, I said. It survives what other people budget. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. She looked less cruel than frightened.
You have no idea what collapse costs, she said quietly.
Everything in this city rests on balance. You pull one thread, people drown. I thought of dry cisterns and mothers watering soup to fool hungry children. Some of us already did. Then I walked away. The final Meridian trials required a live field deployment. Teams would test their systems in the lower estuary, where old drainage channels crossed reclaimed industrial land. 2 nights before the event, someone broke into the storage locker assigned to me and smashed 6 of my listener nodes. The casing fragments were scattered across the floor like teeth. I stood there so still that the campus guard asked whether I was going to faint. "No," I said. "I am deciding." He mistook that for resignation. It was not. By dawn, I had rebuilt 4 units from spare parts, borrowed processors, and the patient stubbornness of every woman I had ever known. Adrian skipped a sponsored dinner to solder new boards beside me. Mr. Dorian sent down archived acoustic couplers no one officially owned, and Lynn Torres, a second-year coding scholar from the Eastern Reefs whom I knew mostly by sight and rumor, appeared in the lab doorway with a toolkit and said, "I hear you are making enemies above your income bracket." We became a team by necessity. Lynn rewrote the compression stack for the listeners. Adrian handled live triangulation. I rebuilt the mesh and mapped the test grid by hand. At the estuary, spectators watched from raised platforms while judges monitored feeds in shaded booths. Salt air blew off the water. Cameras hovered like patient insects. Seraphine's array performed first. It was elegant, expensive, and spectacularly good at identifying urban leakage signatures. The crowd applauded. Mara Quill looked satisfied. Then it was our turn. We buried the listeners along an abandoned drainage cut and linked them to the tide mesh interface Lynn had assembled overnight. I began the demonstration exactly as submitted. Then, midway through, I switched the source dataset from the test grid to the historic Southern water records hidden inside my mother's notebooks. Adrian shot me a sharp look. This was not the approved plan. It was, however, the point at which caution had ceased to deserve obedience. The screens behind us filled with layered maps, official reservoir releases in blue, freight movements in gold, unreported extraction anomalies in red. A murmur ran through the crowd. As configured, I said into the field microphone, the system does more than locate groundwater. It identifies discrepancy patterns between declared water flows and observed distribution outcomes. One of the judges stood up. Mara Quill was already speaking to an aide with a face gone flat as glass. I kept going. On the central screen, the Southern Territories bloomed into view. Red Basin flashed like a wound. So did dozens of other towns I had only known as names on freight lists. Over 14 years, I said, specific districts were repeatedly classified as low-priority recovery zones in advance of documented shortages. That classification depressed baseline allocations. The resulting scarcity increased emergency contract demand. Those contracts, directly or indirectly, were serviced by companies connected to Quill Maritime Holdings. Someone cut my microphone. The sound vanished from the speakers, but the screens remained and the audience was already reading. Mara Quill stepped onto the field with security at her back. "This presentation is unauthorized and materially defamatory," she announced. Lynn, bless her unruly soul, rerouted our local audio through the judge monitoring channel. My voice came back a heartbeat later from every booth at once. "These records originate from the archived Tide Map project," I said, louder now. "Cross-verification files are available. Physical logs remain in the Helix subarchive. My mother documented the discrepancies before the project was shut down." Mara looked not at me but at Lucian Vale, who had arrived in a wheelchair at the rear platform without my noticing. The entire crowd turned with her. Lucian raised one shaking hand.
"Let her finish," he said.
It was not a shout. It did not need to be. Security stopped. Mara's expression changed in a way I will never forget. Not guilt. Not outrage. Calculation, cornered by timing. She could deny the data later. She could challenge method, custody, interpretation, but she could not put ignorance back into the people who had just seen the map. I finished the demonstration with my hands steady and my pulse somewhere behind me. When the final overlay appeared, it highlighted not only the theft but the remedy. The forgotten branch streams beneath the south, the neglected retention basins, the feasible restoration corridors. My system did not merely accuse. It offered a way to repair. The applause, when it came, was confused at first, then fractured, then real. Not everyone clapped. Enough did. The next 48 hours turned Halcyon into a machine with its casing ripped off. News channels replayed the estuary footage until the city could recite my mother's name. Board members resigned preemptively. Investigators sealed offices. Quill Maritime stock plunged. Commentators argued over whether I was a whistleblower, a pawn, a prodigy, or a menace. At Helix, half the students avoided me, and the other half wanted to shake my hand in public while privately checking which direction power had begun to flow. I had never seen so much morality outsourced to trend. Seraphine disappeared for 3 days. When she returned, she found me alone on the upper bridge at dusk, the canal beneath us lit copper by the falling sun. She looked older, though that may only have been the absence of certainty. Do you think this makes you righteous? She asked. No, I said. Necessary. Maybe. She gripped the railing hard enough for her knuckles to pale. You think my mother told me everything. She told me enough to be useful and not enough to refuse. I said nothing. She laughed once without humor. That is the worst part about people like you. You leave room for the possibility that we had choices. You did have choices, I answered. Just not clean ones. The wind moved her hair across her face. She did not brush it back. For what it is worth, she said at last, I did not destroy your nodes. I guessed who did, but that is not the same as stopping them. Then she walked away. I believed her. Not because she deserved easy forgiveness, but because guilt and innocence were never the same shape as loyalty. Lucian Vale asked to see me once more before the formal inquiry began. He looked smaller than before, as if truth had weight after all, and he had chosen to carry too much of it too late. The board will try to contain this, he said. There will be settlements, hearings, strategic contrition. They will offer you money, appointments, influence. They may call it restitution. I do not want their influence.
I know.
That is why they will fear you more than if you did. He handed me a sealed portfolio containing the complete recovered tide map core, including my mother's final simulation notes. This belongs with the person who finished it. I did not finish it alone, I said. No, he replied, but you are the one who refused to let it die politely. There was a question between us. Neither of us wanted in words whether I hated him enough to make room for his remorse. In the end, I said only, my mother should have had the life she earned. Lucian closed his eyes. Yes. Before I left, he offered me a permanent seat on the restructured Meridian Advisory Council, full sponsorship through any university in the North, and discretionary control over a development fund in my mother's name. I accepted only one condition. The Tide Mesh framework would be released open source to public districts, with training rights guaranteed to Southern schools and municipalities at no cost. No proprietary licensing. No selective access. No polished speeches about inclusion while data sat behind gates. Lucian agreed before his lawyers could object. The inquiry stretched through exam season, but I kept studying. Not because I had become noble beyond ambition, but because I had promised myself long before Halcyon that no one would use crisis to drag me off my path. When final rankings were posted, my name stood first across the entire institute. Adrian came second and pretended not to mind with such severity that it became comic. You realize, he said, handing me the results printout, that I now have to become insufferably industrious out of spite. You were already insufferable, I said. He considered that.
Fair.
Then, unexpectedly, he held out a mechanical compass case, old brass polished by years of use. My grandfather's, he used it in field surveys. Take it. I can't. You can. I am lending it until you build something better. It was the closest either of us came to sentiment. The official investigation eventually confirmed what my mother had found and what Lucian had failed to stop. Allocation forecasts had been manipulated by a cluster of private contractors tied to Quill Maritime and 2 partner firms. Mara Quill resigned before charges were finalized. Some people called that justice. People with secure water systems often have very low standards for the word. What mattered more was that emergency restoration funds were redirected south, reservoir audits became public, and tide mesh pilots began in 12 drought districts before the year ended. The first district on the list was Red Basin. I did not go back immediately. Not because I doubted home, but because I wanted to return with plans instead of promises. I spent the summer with Lynn and a small volunteer team adapting the system for towns without stable grid power. We learned to build resilient kits from cheap components and local materials. We designed hand-crank diagnostics, dust-proof casings, solar strips that could be stitched onto shade cloth, and training manuals written in plain language instead of institutional theater. In September, I finally boarded the southbound freight line with 3 crates of equipment, 2 field engineers, and my mother's notebooks in a waterproof tube. Red Basin looked smaller when I returned, but not weaker. The station was still a skeleton of rust and memory. The school roof still wore its silver patchwork. The wind still knew my name. People came out to meet us one by one, then in clusters, then with the full, unstoppable curiosity of a town that had spent too long being discussed by strangers.
Mrs.
Calder from the store hugged me hard enough to bruise. Old Nevin from the repair yard asked whether the city had finally learned to boil its own vanity. Children followed the crates, chanting that I had brought machines from the north. Not machines, I corrected. Maps that listen. We set up the first sensor line at the dry creek beyond the school, where my mother had once taken me to show me how land remembers rivers even after men erase them from paper. The ground rang differently at 7 meters than at 4. At 9, the signal shifted again, deeper and cleaner. When the drill team hit moisture on the second day, the town went silent before it cheered. I stood there with clay on my boots and my mother's compass in my hand, listening to the first honest applause I had heard in months. Water came slowly after that, because repair is slower than theft and less glamorous than scandal. We restored cisterns, reinforced storage, and marked future well sites across the basin shelf. The Meridian Board sent photographers, naturally. I sent them away unless they were willing to carry pipe. Very few were. By winter, the old school had a new annex funded under the reparation grant. I named it the May Arlen Field Lab before anyone could argue for something sterile and donor-friendly. We taught local students how to read hydrological scans, repair listener nodes, and challenge official reports with their own data. Knowledge I had learned was most dangerous when it stopped asking permission. Letters arrived from universities. Offers arrived from ministries. Invitations arrived from people who had once considered me an embarrassment to architecture. I accepted a place in systems engineering at North Coast University on one condition. Each year, I would spend one full term back in the southern districts running field programs. The university agreed, perhaps because public refusal would have looked ungrateful on the news. I did not mind their reasons as long as the work stood. The night before I left Red Basin again, I climbed the hill above the rail spur to my mother's grave with the final completed tide mesh atlas under my arm. The wind was sharp and cold. Below me, the town glimmered around 2 restored tanks and a string of work lights at the new drill site. It was not abundance. It was beginning. I sat on the dry grass and read aloud from the dedication page I had written for the public release, for those who were told scarcity was fate when it was often bookkeeping, for the places that kept living while being measured only by loss, for May Arlen, who taught me that maps are arguments about who matters. I told her about Halcyon then, about the bridges, about Lucian's apology, incomplete but real, about Adrian's compass and Lynn's swearing and the way the estuary crowd had sounded when truth reached them. I told her I still did not know whether justice was a destination or a maintenance schedule. I suspected the latter. She would have appreciated that. When I finished, I placed the original blue thread key on the grave marker. The box beneath her bed no longer needed locking. On my walk back down the hill, I could hear water moving through the temporary line we had laid from the new well to the school tank. It sounded small. It sounded stubborn. It sounded like the first sentence of a better history. Years later, people would tell the story wrong, as they always do. They would make it cleaner. They would say a brilliant girl from the drought south came north, stunned a great institute, exposed corruption, and saved her town. That version fits on posters and scholarship brochures. The truth was less flattering and more useful. I was angry, underprepared, often afraid, and rarely graceful. I did not save Red Basin alone, and the corruption was older than any single villain. I simply followed what my mother had left unfinished, and when people tried to close the file, I learned how to pry. If there was anything heroic in it, it belonged equally to the women who stretched soup, the teachers who patched roofs, the mechanics who taught me to trust sound inside metal, and the archivists who preserved inconvenient paper. It belonged to every town that kept records in pencil because power failed, every child who learned to count by ration tickets, every worker who knew that official numbers and lived reality were not always siblings. Most of all, it belonged to my mother, who had seen the shape of the theft and refused to call it weather. Sometimes on winter mornings at the university, I would wake before the others and spread her notebooks across my desk. I no longer needed them to prove anything. The inquiries were public record now. Tide mesh had become a required case study in 3 departments and an irritation to private contractors everywhere. But I kept reading because her notes reminded me what intelligence looks like before institutions file it into acceptable shapes. She was messy in the margins, ruthless towards sloppy assumptions, unexpectedly funny beside impossible equations. Once, in the corner of a draft release model, she had written, "If this fails, pretend confidence and adjust the valves." I laughed out loud when I found that line. Then I cried, because grief is greedy and likes to hide in the folds of laughter. Adrian found me that way in the library annex and sat down without speaking. After a while, he said, "You know, for someone who claims not to care what institutions think, you have forced several to redesign themselves. I recommend the experience only to enemies," I said. He nodded.
Reasonable.
Then he added, "The Southern Field Grant came through. We can expand to 6 more districts." We became, over time, the kind of friends forged not by similarity, but by repeated usefulness under pressure. He preferred order. I preferred traction. Ling preferred chaos with measurable results. Together we built programs none of our younger selves would have believed possible. Public data cooperatives, community audit labs, training routes that moved between coast and interior by rail. In some towns, officials welcomed us. In others, they smiled with all their teeth while asking who had authorized our measurements. We kept measuring. The deeper lesson of tide mesh was never only about water. It was about visibility. Scarcity thrives where records are private and suffering is anecdote. The moment people can count what is taken from them and show it on a wall large enough for everyone to read, power starts losing its favorite hiding place. That was the real inheritance my mother left me. Not martyrdom, not bitterness, method. Years after the inquiry, I received one last letter from Seraphine Quill. It came from a coastal clinic where she was reportedly doing public rehabilitation work to soften the family scandal. I expected apology shaped like strategy. Instead, the note was short. You were right that we had choices. I hate that sentence, which is how I know it matters. The clinic's pumps are badly calibrated. If you ever want the satisfaction of correcting my work again, write back. I laughed for a full minute. Then I sent her a manual, 3 annotations, and a list of parts suppliers with prices inflated just enough to be educational. Redemption, like engineering, benefits from field conditions. As for Lucien Vale, he died the following spring. In his final testament, he transferred part of his personal estate into an independent public infrastructure trust, barred from corporate board control. Commentators called it a noble late gesture. I called it what it was, a repair bill. Still, bills paid matter more than speeches regretted. They invited me to speak at the dedication ceremony in Halcyon. I stood on the same terrace where I had once first seen the city and watched donors arrange their expressions for virtue. Then I told them plainly that no trust, however generous, should exist as a substitute for fair systems. Charity is unstable architecture if justice remains optional. Some applauded, some stiffened. One columnist later described the speech as gratitude adjacent. I framed that article in the May Arlen Field Lab. There are evenings even now when I walk the perimeter of Red Basin and watch children race between the sensor posts as if they had always belonged there. The tanks are painted bright now to keep the heat down. The school annex smells of solder and chalk. On the far ridge, new wind catchers turn above the repair station. The town is not rich. It may never be. But our drought plans are our own. Our records are public, and our students learn early that any map worth using can be questioned. When visiting officials ask what changed our future, they usually expect a story about technology or a generous foundation or a gifted student who beat the odds. I tell them the future changed when people who had been treated like background noise obtained instruments, evidence, and the nerve to insist their reality counted more than polite summaries. Sometimes they look disappointed. They wanted a miracle. I offer maintenance schedules and civic literacy instead. Miracles make poor infrastructure. If you stand at the old rail spur after rain, on the rare years when rain still comes generously, you can see the basin floor darken in branching lines. They look exactly like the phantom rivers in my mother's notebooks. Not imaginary after all, only ignored by people who preferred their profits cartographed. I keep one page of her original map pinned above my work table. The paper is fragile now, the ink faded at the folds, but her final note remains clear. Someone will finish this if the need remains. When I first read that line, I thought it was prophecy. Now I understand it as instruction. Need remains. So does the work. So do we. And in Red Basin, when the pumps start each dawn and the first water of the day moves through the pipes, the whole town can hear it. It is not a grand sound. It is not victory music. It is a practical, persistent rush through repaired metal. But every time I hear it, I think of my mother's notebooks, of the hidden streams beneath the south, of the estuary screens blooming red and blue before a crowd that could no longer pretend not to know. And I think this, with gratitude sharpened into purpose, water remembers. So do we,